Hello, my name is Brother Larry Whitney, and I'm here with my colleagues Dr. Neville and Dr. Song to talk about Boston Confucianism. All of us have connections with Boston University. I serve there as University Chaplain for Community Life and am a doctoral candidate in philosophical and comparative theology there. Dr. Neville recently retired from Boston University, and Dr. Song recently completed his PhD at BU, his second PhD, and I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit more in a little while. I wanted to take a few minutes as we're setting off here to give a little bit of an introduction to Boston Confucianism, so we have some common starting points for our conversation. And of course, in order to talk about Boston Confucianism, we have to talk a little bit about Confucianism writ large, and what is this phenomenon and where does it come from? It comes from originally the Warring States period in ancient China in the 5th through 3rd centuries BCE. It came originally actually a little bit before that, from the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era, when Confucius gathered a group of students and advocated a set of practices and ideas for reforming the Chinese state in ancient China. And these texts were compiled later after his death in 479 before the Common Era in a text called the Lunyu, what we call the Analects, a set of sayings of Confucius, some of which may go back to him, but many of which probably came via his students later. And then two other thinkers from that period, Mengzi and Xunzi, who are thinkers who were trying to figure out how to use ideas that they got from Confucius to fix the dilapidated state of the Chinese Empire at that time that had fallen into disarray. And it's why it's known as the Warring States. And they developed a number of ideas about how to fix that using ritual and trying to reform moral principles in the era to cultivate better leadership. And those principles were handed on and eventually became what we now know as the Confucian tradition. Codified in the Han Dynasty, it became the state ideology of China for most of the dynastic period. There was a renewal of Confucianism in China in the Neo-Confucian period, the Tang through the Song dynasties, 722 through 1644 before the Common Era. The two major thinkers of that period were Zhu Xi, who lived from 1130 to, wrote mainly from 1130 to 1200 in the Common Era, and then Wang Yangming, a general and scholar and educator who came a bit later, 1472 through 1529 of the Common Era. Now, in the earlier period, Confucians were known as scholars, as literati, and it was through that scholarly or literary formation that Confucians became moral exemplars and leaders in the Chinese state. And they did this primarily by studying the Wu Jing, the 5 classics. And these texts were literary texts, they were historical texts, they were poetic texts, philosophical texts that helped in the moral formation of those who read them, along with commentaries on those texts. But in the Neo-Confucian period, we see a shift led by Zhu Xi to reading now the 4 books, which included the Analects and the texts of the Mencius, and then 2 texts from the 5 classics got particularly emphasized, the Great Learning and the Doctrine of the Mean. And this is a major shift with from what had come before. The texts of Confucius in the Analects and the texts of Mencius in the Mencius were not actually stressed in the formation of Confucianism until the Neo-Confucian period. But now they come to the fore, and Confucius really, having written these texts in the prior to the Warring States period, now becomes known as in his own words, in a sense, or at least through the words he's ascribed by his students, becomes central to the tradition, where he'd been more central to the tradition in an ideal sense until the Neo-Confucian period. That tradition of Neo-Confucianism continued through the end of the Qing dynasty, when the imperial system ended in China. And Confucianism, in a sense, lay dormant for quite a while, until its resurrection here in the West by Dr. Neville in Boston Confucianism, Boston Confucianism came out as a book in the year 2000, and the big contribution that Dr. Neville made in that text was to argue that Confucianism is not only embedded in Chinese culture, that it's actually a world philosophy. It's a set of principles and ideas that can be extricated from Chinese culture and made relevant in other cultures around the world. And so the notion at the time in following the Qing dynasty was that really Confucianism was so deeply embedded in Chinese and wider East Asian culture that it couldn't be appropriated into other systems of thought. And he made the case that no, in fact, it can be transported, portable tradition in late modernity, transported to other cultures and made relevant. And then his colleague, John Berthrong, who also is retired now from Boston University, Dr. Berthrong wrote a journal article in 2003 in which he elaborated 4 steps for making Confucianism relevant beyond the Chinese culture. He said that first, in order to do that, you have to learn the Confucian tradition, the 5 classics, the 4 books, and the commentaries, and the tradition of interpretation. And you have to figure out how to appropriate those within your own context. And then to interpret them and to make them relevant to your context so that you can commend elements of the tradition to that context. And so in a sense, what Dr. Neville and Dr. Berthrong did was to make available the learning of the tradition and encourage that it be appropriated. And now for Dr. Song and I and others, I think we're in the mode of the latter 2 steps of interpreting that tradition and figuring out how to commend it to a wider American audience. And that's what Boston Confucianism now is all about, is figuring out what is it from the Confucian tradition that we want to make relevant in an American and a global setting. Confucianism is experiencing a global revival. Dr. Anna Sun of Kenyon College is eloquent in describing that phenomenon, and we're here as very much part of that. So a few ways in which that has been happening. First, Dr. Song and I have founded the Boston University Confucian Association, and that has been active on the Boston University campus in a number of ways with text studies and retreats and conferences. Our colleagues at the University of Chicago have also founded an association they call the Confucian Commons that meets regularly to discuss texts and how they appropriate those texts in their texts and ideas in their lives. There's a very strong online presence of Boston or North American or global Confucianism called Friends from Afar on Facebook, and this is a discussion group for people trying to figure out what Confucianism might mean for us in a modern period today. Dr. Song created a Confucianism primer on the Huffington Post blog, and this has been very important for making the tradition accessible in the late modern world for folks looking to understand the tradition and what it might mean for them. And then just a few weeks ago, we hosted a large, what was originally supposed to be a small regional conference, but ended up becoming a large 3-day international conference with folks from China and from Europe and from all over the US coming together to talk about rectifying the name of Confucianism to help make Confucianism more accessible in the US context and the global context. So those are a few of the activities that we've been undertaking. Some ideas we need to think about as we're thinking about what Confucianism might be in the modern world. One is the notion of Protestantization, which is a technical academic category developed by Peter Berger. He took it out of a set of polemical categories that had been developed by people in non-Protestant religious traditions who were getting concerned about the fact that their own traditions were starting to look more and more like Protestantism. Professor Berger took that idea and made it a scholarly category for understanding what happens to intellectual and religious traditions when they come, particularly to the US. And he talked about it in terms of how communities become institutionalized as congregations with a discernible leadership in the US context. And so one of the questions for us as Boston Confucians is, should Confucianism look like a church? And I think, generally speaking, it's very hard to think about historical Confucianism looking anything like a congregational church here in the US. And so then, if it's not going to be that, what is it going to look like? Frequently, traditions, Protestantized traditions, are asked to articulate their identity with recourse to a set of texts and traditions. That makes a lot more sense with regard to Confucianism. There are a set of texts and traditions, but there's a lot more than that. It's not just an intellectual tradition, it's also a practical tradition, a spiritual tradition in a sense. But it's not one that's primarily focused on identity. If you ask most Chinese folks if they're Confucian, they'll look at you very strangely. But nevertheless, many folks in China still practice tomb sweeping, for example, which is a very Confucian practice of filial piety, of xiao. So there's some negotiation to be had here about the notion of identity, and does one have to identify as a Confucian to be a Confucian, and can Confucian ideas have relevance in the contemporary context without being adopted as an identity? And then in Protestantization, communities are asked to elaborate a set of individual and communal practices to cultivate that identity as a community. And again, there are some particular practices like tomb sweeping that have become directly correlated with this Confucian identity, but those may not be the practices that become most relevant here in the United States as we incarnate Confucianism here. And so what will those practices be? And if those practices aren't oriented toward creating identity, then what are they about? What do they do for us? So the question Dr. Berthrong raised of what is it that Confucianism has to commend to American culture, I think I like to break into three broad categories. First, in the notion of li, which is often translated as ritual, or civility, or etiquette, or a whole lot of other things besides. It's a term that we have a lot of trouble translating. This can provide us an analytic framework for understanding American culture and society writ large, and is also a way of diagnosing socio-political and economic disorders and why society is not working well in many cases, and then how to reform society to be better. So that's one thing Confucianism can offer. Another, in a late modern context, is that Confucianism offers a non-theistic religion or spirituality. I struggled whether or not to use the word naturalistic. We can, all three of us can sit up here and debate ad nauseum, ad infinitum, whether Confucianism is naturalistic or not. And part of that depends on what we mean by naturalism. But it certainly is a non-theistic religion or religiosity or spirituality. And so concepts like qiandi, heaven and earth, give some ontological ultimates to the tradition. The notion of Tao, of way making, is a spiritual path that we follow that's built into the nature of reality. Yin-yang, dark, bright, is one way of translating it. Again, a term that's very problematic in translation, but gives us some metaphysical principles. And the notion of qi, of vital energy, or cosmological ultimates at play in the world that Confucianism uses. And again, these are also analytic categories for understanding life and how we move through life as people on the way. And then the third thing I talk about in terms of what Confucianism can commend to modern American society and global society and life is an ethic for social harmony and peace. And so concepts like run, humaneness, chung, sincerity, what it means to be authentic and honest in a culture. The notion of becoming a junzi, an exemplary person, and the importance of that for leadership in society. The notion of wu wei, of effortless action, of being able to cultivate harmony simply by being a moral exemplar without having to use coercion or force. De, moral force itself, is a way of having influence by embodying moral character as a junzi, as an exemplary person. And then xiao takes this into the family realm and the notion of filial piety. In terms of how do we relate to one another as parents and children, and then those parents who are also children of an older generation. How do we make family harmonize our family relationships and then our wider communal relationships, and then that extends further into state relationships. So I think these are all things Boston Confucians were committed to discussing and to making relevant in the modern world, late modern world, as Dr. Neville likes to put it, and are things that I think we can now have a conversation about as we share this rich tradition that is emerging just over the last 18 years since Boston Confucianism came out about Confucianism in late modernity. So I turn things over to Dr. Neville.
My name is Robert Cummings Neville. I'm, as Larry said, the author of the book Boston Confucianism, and I've been teaching for a long time. I'm very proud of both of these who are my students, two of my greatest accomplishments. The importance of Confucianism for me comes from the fact that I'm a philosopher, and I have come to believe that all of the world's cultures need to contribute to a global conversation in response to the real philosophic issues of our time. So my concern is not so much from within Confucianism to extend it, but rather to draw Confucianism into the conversation, which is set by a great variety of world factors. One of these Larry has already mentioned, and that is that our society is very much structured by rituals. It's rituals that allow us to greet one another, to make eye contact, to speak language. There are different rituals, English rituals, Chinese rituals, but rituals for expressing ideas. I think that all of the aspects of high civilization are made up of ritual activities that are interdependent and lead up to the kinds of things that we're seeing now. A conversation in a city different from where any of us lives, with high equipment quality, and those are all ritual activities. Everybody's playing roles and we interact, and those things need to be understood. Without understanding the ritualized behaviors that we have, we won't be able to identify serious social issues, for instance, such as racism. Racism is not just people having bad attitudes toward people with other races. It's having practices that embody racism. In the supermarket that I go to in Boston, it's a very mixed community, but mainly African American. And the managers of the store put all the fat foods first with lots of fancy advertising, even though fat foods are bad for African Americans particularly. They don't recognize that it's racism. It doesn't look like racism because the African Americans like to buy fatty foods. So I think that when we analyze the structure, say, of a supermarket, we're going to be able to see where there is racism. Same thing with many, many other issues in our society. We live in a time of fairly great political partisanship, and the partisanship comes in large measure because we have rituals that do not engage one another. So the people on the left, they have rituals for the left. People on the right have rituals for the right. There are very few rituals that allow for conversation to be together. And the politics of recent times seems to be advocating fewer rituals that bear courtesy so that you can have people disagree with one another courteously, but still with serious connections. So, one of the things that Confucianism can contribute in the current philosophic and political and social situation is an understanding of how all of our activities are structured by conventions that we learn. And these conventions might be unimportant or they might be important. East Asians tend to learn to stand with their feet parallel. European Americans learn to stand with their feet out at an angle. It doesn't really make much difference. It may not make much difference whether we learn to speak in Chinese or learn to speak in English. But when it comes to the interactions between people, the Confucian theory of ritual, going back to Xunzi, whom Larry mentioned, is that rituals are to connect communities that otherwise are disconnected. So the rituals don't set the boundaries of communities, they set the connections of communities. And I think that's very important in the current political situation. Another philosophic point where Confucianism can make a contribution has to do with the conception of nature, society, and persons. In the dominant Western philosophic conversations, nature is taken to be something separate from the human. Humanity is understood in terms of inner subjectivity, and nature is something that is constructed by human subjectivity and reinforced in science. Well, I think that's a great mistake. I think that nature has far stars and mountains and oceans, and it also has social institutions, communities, and it also has individuals who are interacting among themselves in nature in all these senses. And Confucianism has 2.5 millennia of experience talking about the continuities of nature, from the things that astronomers would talk about to the things that psychologists would talk about. And I think that we can learn from Confucianism to restructure our scientific way of describing the world so as to emphasize those connections. Related to that is the fact that in the dominant Western philosophic conception, science defines nature, and it does so as not having any particular value. Or the value of things in nature comes only from what is imputed to nature by human beings. The Chinese Confucians have understood from the beginning that just to be a thing is to have a certain kind of value. And that value is something that has to be interpreted. It's always made relative to the positions that people have when they talk about things and interact with them. But it's very difficult in the Western scientific approach to be able to register the values of things. And so we can learn from Confucianism how to rethink our science so as to appreciate the values of things and the perspectives on those values that come from human interpreters. Now, most of the time when people think about Confucianism, they think about that as having to do with the cultivation of inner character. And many of the Confucian texts are about that. The Confucian conception of the self is that it's a kind of polarity between a very inward sense of the heart-mind and what the Chinese call the 10,000 things of the world. It's the continuity between them. The continuity is made with our bodies, with our social interactions. It's made with our language. There are all sorts of things that connect each one of us with the external world. And the external world is not really external. That's a Western expression. The external world is part of who each one of us is. And so the Confucian conception of moral development has to do with developing continuity and clarity. Larry mentioned Chung, or sincerity, is the way it's usually translated. And that means a kind of transparency, so that we can see who people are through how they dress, through how they act, and through our own attitudes toward them as they come to us. Now, I think that this kind of sense of individuals being different by virtue of their different bodies or their different positions, their different places within the family and social community, but still in continuity, that's something that the modern global philosophic conversation can learn from the Chinese. Well, I could go on and talk about the things that are really valuable for Confucianism in the global conversation. We can talk later about the issues of how these things can be learned, but they can be learned in many different ways, not the least of which is in college.
Hi, my name is Bin Song. My family name is Song. In Chinese way, I should put my surname as the first, but since I am in America, I put it in the last position. And for Confucians, they always contextualized their teaching, their learning to benefit the local community. So I decided to put my surname in the back. I graduate, I have as introduced by my best friend Larry. By the way, these speakers are both my friends and my mentor, and I learn a lot with them, and I really benefited from all sorts of interaction through the years. So thank you very much to be here and include me in this great panel. I grew up in China. My first graduate degree is in philosophy. It's in mainly Western philosophy. I learned Cartesian philosophy, the French philosopher Descartes in France for 1 year, and then I graduated from Nankai University and teach there for a couple of years. And around 2011, I have a chance to study in Harvard Yanqing Institute as a visiting scholar on Asian studies. And at that time, the first time in my life, I heard the term Boston Confucianism. It's actually Dr. Bertrand gave a book talk in the Center of Study of World Religions in Harvard Divinity School. And that afternoon was also the first time I met Dr. Neville. And the idea is just so fascinating to me. Because anyone has any knowledge of the ancient Chinese intellectual history, they will know the kind of like the very bad time Confucianism have gone through in early modern China. The fact that my friend Larry introduced Boston Confucianism as kind of like the third areas of the development of Confucianism, that is very accurate, but it's kind of like did not tell the full story, how valuable this revival of Confucianism in American background is. As I mentioned, in early modern China, lots of radicalized Chinese intellectuals, their country is kind of like invaded by Western colonial power, and they try to find a way to fight through it, to even win over this Western colonial power. And during the process, they think Confucianism is very bad. It's the reason why China lags behind. There's a radical anti-Confucian discourse run through constantly in early modern China, from the early modern China until Cultural Revolution. The end of the year's Cultural Revolution is in 1978. So I was born in 1981. So when I grew up, I cannot learn much about Confucianism or any other traditional Chinese culture in school. But I do have a chance in my college to learn this ancient Chinese philosophy, mostly by myself. The reason I choose to learn Western culture is actually kind of like follow some idea of early intellectuals in modern China. They say in order to kind of like catch up with the more advanced type of Western culture, you must learn Western philosophy, learn science, learn democracy. I follow the trajectory fairly closely. But as I mentioned, I learned Asian Chinese culture by myself, and I definitely acknowledge lots of values that has been passed down by my own culture, especially those Confucian values. And but it's hard to find a way to fix my endorsement of this value into the general kind of like a personal biographical development of my character and my person. But in 2011, I get a chance to know this term Boston Confucianism and began to think about how the entire tradition originates and develops. I find the globalization, the globalization of Confucianism does not start from modern China or start from Boston Confucianism. It's actually Confucianism as a tradition, it always develops, it always changes. along the time and in face of new challenges. For example, at the very first beginning, Confucianism, as it is shaped by the historical figure Confucius, is just a small area phenomenon. The Confucius home state is called the state of Lu. It's barely bigger than Washington, D.C., actually. So Confucius opened the first private school in ancient Chinese civilization. It is based in the state called Lu. And in Han Dynasty, about 500 years after Confucius died, Confucius has lots of students, lots of followers, but Confucianism develops a media intellectual polemics. There's so many different schools of thought. They compete each other. They try to propose different statecrafts, different ethical idea, different political philosophy. And it turns out in Han Dynasty, as a scholar called Dong Zhongshu, he succeeded to promote Confucianism as kind of like a state ideology. So from a very small local phenomenon becomes a nationwide endorsed official state ideology. That's already kind of geographic change. And then in Neo-Confucianism, in Song and Han Dynasty mentioned by Dr. Larry, there's a great challenge from Buddhism. Buddhism originated from South Asia and then migrates to China. So in face of this challenge, Confucianism reinterpreted its own resources and proposed a more systematic version of philosophy, including metaphysics, ethics, political philosophy. So it becomes kind of like the dominant intellectual trend, but under the condition that it sufficiently meet this challenge from outside. And through this time, Confucianism also migrates to other Eastern Asian countries like Korea, like Japan, like Vietnam. So now Confucianism is not only a Chinese phenomenon. And then in the third area, beginning from 19th century, at the end of 19th century, and mostly happening in 20th century, Confucianism based mainly at the beginning, mainly based on Hong Kong or Taiwan, this Chinese diasporic community in South Asia, and then migrates to the Western society. So Boston Confucianism, why it's kind of like it becomes a very exciting idea to Chinese scholars. If you look into some contemporary Chinese textbook of Chinese philosophy, they will introduce Boston Confucianism as kind of like how the Confucian tradition now geographically can migrate, can expand more to the other area. Even traditionally, this area is not a Chinese-based culture. It's not a Chinese culture. So, but one phenomenon really striking me and also the other researchers is during this process expansion, development, Confucianism does not develop itself through a certain kind of missionary initiative. There's no priest, there's no minister, there's no missionary for Confucian tradition. People, the major idea of Confucian education is, there's a quote from the book called the Book of Ritual, Li Ji. It says, what following ritual propriety is stay here to have students come to learn rather than go outside to teach students. So the basic idea is you must cultivate yourself well enough. You have knowledge, you have skill, and then you stay here. Your moral influence will gradually radiate across community, across areas, to attract the other people to come to learn. So this is the ideal type of Confucian education, and also tied to how we can promote Confucianism in America. As mentioned by Larry, all these institutions, Boston University Confucian Association, actually we don't have any email list. We don't have a member sheet. We want the Confucian tradition to keep its original idea. This is a tradition of scholars. This is a tradition of education. So all this kind of like spread thought process must be based upon some very soft, voluntary participation of all sorts of people. And since Dr. Larry and Dr. Neville talk about the value of Confucianism to America, and from my own perspective, I have to, since I grew up in China and I learned in the West, and now I teach in Washington College. It's a liberal arts college in Eastern Shore of Maryland. It's a great liberal arts college. Actually, I teach Introduction to Confucianism this semester to 6 brilliant undergraduate students. I grew up in China, and I teach here, I learn here. I have to emphasize the kind of like from a Chinese perspective, the value of studying and spreading Confucian thought in America. I think the biggest value for the tradition is can detach from nationalism, from any parochial expression of the tradition within any concrete polity or even culture. So in my understanding, lots of Confucian values and lots of the practices actually transcend all concrete times, concrete polities, concrete cultural systems, and individually, it really can take to be a principle of life to guide you through all vicissitudes and changes of personal life. But for a country or for a community, it can also be taken as a guidance of life that can sort through all sorts kinds of changes and challenges in different times and different contexts. So if we try to study Confucianism and try to teach it in America, it's kind of like has a better opportunity for scholars trying to find out all those unchanging or more elastic, flexible, or good side of Confucianism, and then flesh it out in this context. So I think this is a great opportunity for the tradition to grow, to develop, and even to reform in this new area in North America.
I mentioned before that there's a strong emphasis in Confucianism on the cultivation of character. In balance to this is the office of the scholar official. A scholar official is somebody who ministers to the social arrangements that are around. And a scholar official can work in Washington, D.C. for one of the bureaucracies, or can be a politician. Or a scholar official can take responsibility for running part of a family or a local institution. And although this is perhaps not universally accepted among Confucians, I think that for Confucianism in America, it's very important to recognize that to be a good person is to be actively involved in the society in which you are, working to make it better. And so there's a balance between inner virtue, or sageliness. To be a sage is a Confucian ideal, and to be a scholar official, which means that you're involved in the hustle and bustle of things. And as many people in public life have learned, in public life you often lose. There simply is no way to make the connections that you would like to make. And therefore, running through Confucianism, going back to its roots in China, is a sense of the tragic, I believe, of the fact that you commit yourself as a scholar official and as a sage to addressing the issues of your day, and you win sometimes, but you also lose sometimes. And part of one of the images that's important in Confucianism from early times is the need to retreat. So you engage yourself as much as you can, but there are times when you have to back off. And entering into public life and retreating from public life, recovering yourself and going back into public life, or when you get old, retiring from public life. Those are things that are crucial for understanding what it is to be an individual in Confucianism, and what it is to live in a society as understood Confucianly.
One that pops immediately to mind is an emphasis on family. And in traditional Chinese culture, Confucian influenced, that's often talked about in terms of very highly structured roles between parents and children, and between parents and their parents, the grandparents, and honoring of ancestors, that sort of thing. In American life, too, historically, we've had fairly strong roles in different parts of families in terms of fathers being heads of households and women having particular roles in running the daily life of the household, children working to support the family. And so historically, there's a lot of consonance. One of the things that has shifted in both American and Chinese culture is the notion of what a family is in many cases, and what a family can be, who can be part of a family, and the roles are shifting a lot in American culture. Roles have shifted a lot in Chinese culture as well, I think, especially in recent years with the one-child policy and things like that. That's forced a lot of shifts in Chinese culture around how families are understood. So I think this is a great moment for Confucianism to step in and think about the rituals of family life, of what xiao, of what filial piety is going to mean into the future. Because I don't think in either American or Chinese life it's going to continue to look like what it used to look like, perhaps. That may be a good thing, and very likely is a good thing, as we understand gender roles differently, as we understand the ways that at times children lead their parents. One of the things I get excited about is the ways in which multi-generational families are becoming a thing again. That kind of stopped being a thing for a while here in the U.S. And my own family exemplifies that in some ways with my in-laws moving to town. So I think there's some exciting ways in which the Confucian notion of ritual and of family and of the ability to rethink those roles as other parts of the social order change, that are really rich and exciting as we continue to move forward.
I agree with that, but I also would want to stress the fact that when we talk big about the family, we're talking about ideals, and the ideals stand in contrast to what their actual state of affairs is. So Confucius himself lived in really bad times. Families were split up. Economic support for families was terrible. It was a bad time. And he then invented the idea of going back to the rituals of the great emperors of the legendary past. Most scholars say that he really made up those rituals himself. But the thought that there is an ideal way for families to get along is important when the real situation is not. Now, I think that one of the arguments against the claim that Confucianism is just Chinese is the fact that Confucius was a kind of a critic and a prophet in his own time. What he wanted to do was to change the situation that he was in. This is very contrary to the image of Confucianism as the state ideology. And the image as a state ideology itself, I think, is, according to most historians now, largely false. From time to time, the Confucians would be important in the empire, but generally they were in trouble because they wanted to change the situation that was at hand. And so, to answer your question, one of the values that is common to both to contemporary China and to contemporary United States is the fact that our families are not in good shape, that we need to find support for families. And that's not just minority families, that's also majority families. The anger that comes from the white right is, I think, in part because their families are in trouble. And so probably it is the case that families and neighborhoods are the place to begin to make a difference to how we live, as opposed to votes on who gets to be president or a senator. But the contribution of Confucianism is to say that we do have ideals that can be put into place by improving our rituals.
Great. I think first the question itself is very interesting. The major reason I say so is the influence of Chinese culture, Asian culture to the Western world does not begin from this century. It's actually beginning from Enlightenment, from the early founding fathers' vision of what is the ideal type of politics in America. You know, at that time in early modern Europe, the Catholicism is still dominant, and the power of the church is actually holds a lot of weight in the secular management in the community or in the country. But what the Western, especially Enlightenment philosopher, find Confucian thought interesting is that type of political philosophy does not premised upon any fully enlightened religious leader to guide the entire country. So I think one value shares between Confucianism and American culture is meritocracy. It's meritocracy. So for Asian and Chinese civilization, their basic social strategy to hold together the entire society is to select the most talented person, even from grassroots level of society, to appoint, they need to go through a very hard, rigorous, disciplined process of civil examination. And then after they pass the highest rank of civil examination, they will be appointed to different places to serve the local government, and ideally they can serve also in the central government. That means the politician, they must have merits, and they must go through this very rigorous process of working for different people, harmonizing different communities, and then they can be appointed to more important positions. And in America, I learn a lot of political philosophy. I communicated with different scholars. They actually have a big debate about the relationship between meritocracy and democracy. I think according to some earlier founding fathers' idea, what is the ideal of American democracy, meritocracy, or virtues. These are definitely one indispensable element for the well-functioning of good democracy. This can be realized in different institutions, different time, but definitely a perennial issue for how to construct a better democracy.
I think lots of ways. I think we started getting into some of that with some of what I was discussing earlier about what to commend. The problem is there's so much. I'll just address in the educational realm, one of the things Confucianism has always stressed is the importance of liberal arts education. The importance of liberal learning in the sense of literature and history and poetry, and that the goal of learning is to become a humane person, not simply to know lots of facts or be able to develop new technologies. That can be good, but that's one piece of the puzzle, and really it should be about building, cultivating better people in order to build more harmonious societies. And I think we see globally now a shift away from liberal learning in a lot of cases. At the same time, there are some exciting things happening with liberal arts education, often in smaller liberal arts colleges, and doubling down on the value of that. So I think insofar as Confucianism has this historical rooted grounding scholarship in becoming a literate elite, in transforming society through education and through this literate learning, I think that's a really important contribution to the global conversation right now.
I'd like to go back to the religious question that Bin Song mentioned. Many cultures have a religious culture where you have to belong to it. You have to be a member of it. One doesn't become a member of a Confucian congregation. There you might belong to a temple, but you can also belong to a Buddhist temple. Or in my case, I'm a United Methodist minister. And I don't find any kind of religious conflict there because Confucianism is compatible with many different religious cultures and provides a unique outside way of understanding and criticizing what those religious cultures would be. And so when we think about what could be institutionalized of Confucianism in say, the United States or in France or in Australia or wherever, the institutions would not be setting up separate denominations that would compete with the others. You could be a Confucian and a Buddhist, as many Chinese have been since at least since the 18th century, probably before. Or you could be a secular person religiously and still recognize the religious or spiritual importance of Confucianism. I would say that to be a religion is to have, first, ideas, legends, stories, whatever, about what is ultimate. Second, to have procedures that define a human being existentially. And Confucianism has the commitment to become a sage, the commitment to be a scholar official. And third, practices that allow you to live with regard to what's ultimate. But if you're a Roman Catholic, as Professor DuBarry is, he admitted to being a Boston Confucian after being America's most senior scholar of Confucianism for 50 years. And that was quite possible for him to say that he was a Roman Catholic and a Confucian because they fit together. Now that, I think, is a way of engaging what is ultimate, that's religious, in ways that are not competitive with other religious practices and are not competitive with the breakdown of those other religious practices.
I want to add something to Larry's stress on education. The experience I learned both in China and in the West is, especially after the modern era, everything in the West is based upon certain kind of division and specification. Like you learn, if you are a philosopher, okay, you do not learn religion. And you learn science, you do not learn humanity. And look at the university and the college system. There's so many disciplines, there's so many different areas. It's kind of like a compartmentalization in human knowledge and in human practices. But in Confucianism, everything is held together. You know, if there's a continual debate whether Confucianism is a religion or philosophy or something else. And if you be fully aware of those traditions defined in the Western standard as a philosophy or religion, you will find Confucianism is pretty much both. So this brings a big challenge for teaching of Asian Chinese culture in college, in classroom. For example, usually in philosophy course, if you teach Confucianism as a philosophy, you will pretty much just teach argument, how Confucian scholars debate each other on some similar issue, similar philosophical issue to the West. But if you teach Confucianism as a religion in the Department of Religious Studies, it's kind of like most of the time you will teach it as an observer. You observe what the people in China did, in Asia did, and try to generalize some pattern without necessarily yourself involving in this practice, without yourself advocating this kind of worldview. But in Confucianism, if we have studied how Zhu Xi, Wang Yangming taught in the academy, firsthand, they are critical thinkers. They continually debate about a variety of issues. They do not blindly follow any dogma. But simultaneously, they want to put their thinking and teaching into practice. There are lots of rituals. There's lots of practice of spiritual formations, either for individual or community. It's pretty much according to our today's standards. We learn a philosophy as Confucianism, but we simultaneously want to put this philosophy into practice and make it function in community and in society. This holistic approach of education, I think, is very much needed by American university based upon the current institutional structure of higher education. This is my opinion.
Insung, do you want to say a bit more as well about the work you've been doing on Confucian business practices and the relevance for the American context?
Oh yeah, thank you very much. I would like to talk about this because one of my recent accepted article is on business ethics. I try to argue, in Japan, in Meiji Restoration, when Japan is the earliest country in East Asia who opened its door to the Western world and send some scholars to the West to learn the most updated, advanced institution of modern economy. And during this period, I do some research. I find, because before Meiji Restoration, it's about the middle of 19th century. Before that time, it's called Tokugawa Japan. It's the last imperial, even feudal society, or early modern or pre-modern type of society before Meiji Restoration. And Tokugawa Japan is a Confucian state because all the warriors or the samurais, they are educated in Confucian cultures. So the earliest learner of Western culture sent by the Meiji Japanese government actually are Confucian scholars. And when they come back, firsthand, when they grow up, they have this Confucian knowledge, their cultural heritage. And on the other hand, they learn lots of Western capitalistic business skills and economic knowledges. And they try to combine each other. So when we learn the history of Japanese business, Japanese economy, we find that the entrepreneurs and all the managers, all those leaders in the business world, they manage their business in really a different style from the Western world. It's kind of like based upon some all interconnection of different sectors. So bank and corporation, they have closer relationship beyond just the calculation with interest and the loan. And then government has this kind of like a broader vision how to bring everything together. If a Japanese company runs well, it will pretty much look like a Confucian community. There's a leader, but the leader has really kind of like intimate knowledge towards every participant including the lower rank employee, everybody work together. This more harmonious, more holistic approach of business government really fascinates me. Especially we learn comparative philosophy, comparative religion, but actually because the holistic approach of Confucian culture, we can expand our research into this more practical area. So right now, I'm working on another paper. I actually work with Larry. Because of the conference of rectifying the name of Confucianism, I try to argue, some very important business thinker in America, like Peter Drucker. He has a great interpretation of Confucian business ethics, and thinks it is still very relevant to American business practice today. So yeah, I'm very like to contribute my further efforts in this area.
Earlier, Dr. Neville raised that chung, sincerity or transparency or authenticity, is a very important virtue in Confucianism, and so we should be transparent ourselves in acknowledging that the very term Boston Confucianism started, like so many great philosophical concepts, as a joke. It's a play on the notion of the Boston Brahmins, which is a class of folks up in Boston who drawn from the notion of the Brahmin class in Hinduism. And so if you can have Boston Brahmins, why not also Boston Confucians? But it's also a joke on this idea that Confucianism is so deeply embedded in China that you can't get it out. The idea that being a Boston Confucian is a contradiction in terms. It should be humorous to even try to think of this. So it's a great advance that has happened over the past 18 years since Boston Confucianism came out, to be able to think very rigorously and to have so many scholars from around the world, scholars and leaders in a lot of academic institutions and other sorts of institutions, including the business community and in civil leadership, to think about how Confucianism can be applied across the globe and across all domains of modern life. So thank you to Dr. Neville for having inaugurated this movement, and also for shepherding Binsong and I in our own cultivation, our own moral self-cultivation as Confucians and as scholars and as intellectuals.